Thanks, Niall, and welcome back to everyone. As Niall said, I'm going to talk today about safety reporting and field safety corrective actions and really the post-market phase of medical devices. I think just due to the nature of this presentation, I always seem to get the last presentation of the day, but also probably because it's a bit ominous, because rather than calling it safety reporting and field safety corrective actions, I tend to refer to it as when medical devices go wrong, and they tend to go wrong a fair bit. So it's really to understand what circumstances might that arise, how do we deal with it, and how do you deal with it? So I'm going to talk briefly about the post-market oversight of medical devices, what exactly each actor in the system does in the post-market phase, what legal responsibilities each actor has, and what we would see as maybe best practice. A lot of that will focus on medical device safety, the importance of healthcare professionals, device users, and when I deliver this presentation to patients, it's really everyone in Ireland has in reporting safety issues with medical devices. What legal obligations are placed on the manufacturer to inform us as the regulator when they identify safety issues, and perhaps more importantly, to tell you as the users when they identify safety issues. What types of corrective actions fall within the regulatory system and how are they communicated to you? So, as Niall outlined, we've talked this morning a lot about the pre-market phase and how medical devices get on the market. And I think one of the questions we took there in the panel session was that, while there's not a gap in the system, there's a lot of pressure placed on the system due to its decentralized nature on the post-market phase. And I think that's really recognized and it's envisaged that there needs to be adequate post-market oversight of products legally mandated in the regulations to ensure that devices are safe and that unsafe devices are promptly removed from the market. Now, while these were in place under the medical devices directives, too often they weren't legally obligated or they were insufficiently defined. And one of the drivers for the new medical device regulations was scandals involving breast implants with inappropriate silicone contained in them, the metal-on-metal hip revisions. So we had a series of events where devices had made it to the market and were subsequently found to be unsafe. So the new regulations consider the post-market performance of devices in three distinct systems, but they're very much interrelated. The first is the manufacturer's post-market surveillance system. So this is really how the manufacturer monitors the performance of their device once it's on the market. It really should be taken as a life cycle approach over the entire lifetime of the device. So it needs to look at the device from end to end, from day one that it enters the system to the day it leaves the system. And it needs to feed back into the risk management for the device. And I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail because it is absolutely key to the functioning of the system. Some of the issues that are identified in a manufacturer's post-market surveillance will be sufficiently important that they'll fall into what we call the vigilance system. And many of you may have interacted with the vigilance system, both in your hospitals, but also with the HPRA. And the vigilance system is the regulatory mechanism which really assesses serious incidents which have occurred with medical devices. That's typically one-off events with devices. Field safety corrective actions, which I'll talk about in detail, which are where the issue is identified with the device and a manufacturer is taking a corrective action, but also has other mechanisms for looking at undesirable side effects associated with the device. If there's periodic issues with the device, how are those reported to us? The third element to this is the market surveillance system. I'm not going to talk about the market surveillance system in a lot of detail today, but that is the competent authority mechanism for ensuring that the devices on the market are safe and perform as intended. So essentially with the market surveillance system, we have the power to look at any aspect of a medical device, again, over its entire life cycle and lifetime. We can use the vigilance system as an input to that. So we often look for signals and trends amongst our serious incident or field safety corrective action data to actually see, should we examine a device with additional levels of scrutiny than have previously been adhered to. And that comes into that question that we were asked earlier on. Is the CE mark good enough? Yes, it absolutely is. It ensures that a device is safe and performs as intended. But there is a recognition that an effective post-market surveillance, vigilance, and maybe most importantly, market surveillance system is needed to ensure that those devices on the market continue to perform as intended. So I think it's important to understand that those three elements are distinct but interrelated, and really I'm just going to focus on two of those today. So in terms of post-market surveillance, as I mentioned, it's a manufacturer's system. It's designed to actively and systematically gather, record, and analyze the performance of the device over its entire lifetime. It's used to update the benefit risk of the device and the clinical evaluation. And that's really what I mean when I say across the device life cycle. Data that's gathered in the post-market phase for a device really should be used not only to assess the performance of that specific device, but in an ideal scenario, a manufacturer should be feeding that data back in to promote design improvements to that device, but most importantly, when they're generating the next iteration of that device or their new devices, that they're taking on board that data that they've got from previous devices and previous device performance to actually design safer, better devices. The system also implements and monitors any preventative and corrective actions, and again, we'll talk about that in a little more detail. So, as I said, when I showed you those cogs, these systems, and this system in particular, was in place under the medical device directives, but I think it was recognised it wasn't prescriptive enough. And as Niall and Donal and Nicola have said this morning, when we've all talked about the hundreds of pages we have to deal with, well, boy, is the new post-market surveillance system prescriptive. Because manufacturers are now required to prepare a post-market surveillance plan. So whereas previously it was really a case of every manufacturer for themselves as to how they would monitor the performance of their device, they're now required to actually proactively plan that out, and that document is reviewed by the notified body who is undertaking the assessment of their device as part of the CE marking process. And as I said, this isn't just looking at complaints or incidents with the device. This needs to be a more holistic approach as to how that device is performing in the post-market phase. So is it performing as it is intended? They should have in place thresholds for when to identify that there's warning signals, early warning signals as to whether the device may not be performing as intended, not to wait for an influx of serious incidents associated with the device before identifying a problem. Obviously, they need to monitor the market, but they need to explain how they're going to monitor the market, and it needs to be a proactive phase. We'll talk about user reporting and healthcare professional reporting and the importance of that in a moment, but really the onus is on the manufacturer to have a plan for how they're going to get that information back. They can't be just dumping it on the hospitals to make it their responsibility to tell them about every problem. They actually have to think about how they're going to do this themselves. As I said, they need to be monitoring for statistically significant trends or changes in the performance of their device. They need to have a plan in place for how they're going to communicate when there are any issues with us as a competent authority and with you as users. They need to have really robust and comprehensive procedures to do all of those things and to address their corrective and preventative actions when they've been identified, and really to explore what other measures might they need to put in place for adequate oversight of a device. And one of those most obvious is post-market clinical follow-up. So actually, do they need to put in place greater restrictions, more systematic monitoring of the device once it's on the market to ensure it's safe? And I think that's a real benefit of the new regulations. Again, this is a manufacturer system, but it's critical that you have an understanding of this, because ultimately this is underpinning your assurance that when you see a CE mark on a device, that actually it is safe and it is being monitored once it's on the market. Perhaps the more relevant phase for us here then is the area of vigilance. And as I mentioned in the initial slide, this is when you have issues of significant importance that they actually meet a threshold for regulatory reporting and potentially communication to you as an end user. And apologies if you'll indulge me for a moment, but I want to just go through some definitions because I think it's very important here to understand what is a regulatory reportable incident versus what you might consider as an incident versus what the HSE might consider as an incident. And they don't always align. And I'm going to say that up front. I would love if they did, but they don't. And we'll talk about how we address that in future. So an incident is any malfunction or deterioration in the characteristics or the performance of a device. So something has gone wrong with the device, as well as any inadequacy in the information supplied by the manufacturer. So it can be an error in the labeling, the instructions for use. It could be an ergonomic issue, or any undesirable side effect. So not a side effect that's known to be associated with the device, but an undesirable side effect. And that is the broadest term for what we consider an incident. So a manufacturer, through their post-market surveillance system, should be capturing all performance of the device, but certainly all incidents associated with their device. What the manufacturer is then required to do is to assess whether that incident represents a serious incident. A serious incident is an incident which directly or indirectly might have led to any of the three following outcomes I have on the screen there. The death of a patient or other user or other person, temporary or permanent serious impairment of the patient's, user or other person's state of health, or a serious public health threat. So in the definition of an incident, we have that there's a problem with the device, something has gone wrong. In the definition of a serious incident, we've introduced this risk threshold. So it has to have a minimum potential risk to the patient, to the user of the device, the healthcare professional, or to another person. And it also incorporates that concept of potential. So you'll see the definition says, yes, the event might have led to that. That's a very straightforward situation. But also it introduces that if that event were to reoccur, it might have led to a significant deterioration in state of health. So the vast majority of serious incidents that get reported to us in the HPRA actually haven't resulted in any patient harm, thankfully. They are just potentially risky events, and that's why they need to get reported to us. So I think it's important to understand that is the regulatory definition in the MDR and the IVDR of a serious incident, and any suspected serious incident has to be reported to us by the manufacturer legally, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail. So to assist the manufacturers in making this determination, the competent authorities have generated what we consider to be a quicker and easy way of applying a set of criteria to determine if there's a serious incident. I'm not sure manufacturers would agree with us. But the first is that an incident has occurred. And really that's, as I said, a device has failed to achieve its intended purpose. So the device in some way has failed. It directly or indirectly led to one of the outcomes that I just described. The concept of direct harm is very clear. So something has gone wrong with the device, the patient is injured. The concept of indirect harm also needs to be considered, which means, was there a problem with a piece of diagnostic equipment or diagnostic test that might have led to a subsequent misdiagnosis? So that also needs to be considered by manufacturers in reporting. And then this is really the key bit, and this is where we end up in a lot of discussions with manufacturers. In order to report one of these serious incidents to competent authorities, they have to suspect that there's a causal relationship between the serious incident with the risk thresholds I've described and the fault that their device exhibited. So it can't be a scenario where the device has failed, an entirely different adverse health outcome has happened, there was no potential link between the two of them, and that doesn't fall within the regulatory system. There does need to be a potential causal link. The status quo for that amongst manufacturers is, if in doubt, report the event to us. That's what we always tell them. So we don't want to come do an inspection of a manufacturing site and find several examples where a manufacturer has suspected a potential link but has determined that it wasn't reportable. So any sort of hint of a suspected link gets reported to us. It is legally obligated for a manufacturer to report those type of events to the HPRA. So if they do not do that, they're in breach of the legislation, and that is really, really important for everyone to know. Healthcare professional reporting, on the other hand, in Ireland has always been and is voluntary. So there's not a legal requirement for healthcare professionals or users to report suspected serious incidents to us in the HPRA. About 9% of our individual reports of serious incidents that we get every year are initially received from healthcare professionals. That's a number we would love to see increase, and I'll explain why in a moment. But typically that's not bad across Europe. So there are many other countries across the EU. About 76% of countries in the EU have mandatory reporting, and you don't typically see a commensurate increase in the number of reports coming directly from end users. There's an explicit call within the regulations for us as a competent authority to encourage and promote user reporting. So every year when I fill out my market surveillance report for the European Commission, I'm asked what activities I have undertaken to promote user reporting. At the end of this year, I'll be telling them I was here in May encouraging user reporting. So it really can't be underemphasized how important user reporting is to ensure the timely awareness of issues. And I'll explain a little why that might be and what the unintended reason of that might be in a second. So what are we doing to get that 9% a little higher? The first thing I would say about the 9% is that's where the initial report has come from the healthcare professional or the user. In almost all cases where we are doing a detailed investigation of the serious incident, we will contact the end user that's listed on the report to get their feedback on the case. So just because you haven't reported something to us doesn't mean you might not hear from us. We really want to try and optimize the exchange of information between you as healthcare professionals, end users, clinical engineers, and ourselves. We want to raise awareness of our role and the ability to report, how to report. We have an online reporting portal that I think is quite straightforward to use. I think one of the things when I do these presentations for healthcare professionals, I get told all the time is, I sent in a report for the HPRA and I heard nothing back. And we recognize that's an issue. So we recognize that there needs to be a meaningful feedback mechanism to actually make reporting an event to us worthwhile for you. What that doesn't mean is when you report an event to us, we'll make sure the device is recalled. We do have to do an adequate evaluation of the issue, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge that that is an area that we can improve on, getting feedback to the users who are reporting events to us. We have undertaken very specific activities for specific device types to try and increase user reporting. So we have done a lot of work in urogynecological mesh implants, and we have a dedicated reporting guidance for CTG that has been disseminated through the National Women and Infants Health Programme, which really assists clinicians in that space identify what things should be reported to the HPRA and also through the national systems. Our focus tends to be on education, as I said, but we do really want to work with the different stakeholders to improve this. I would say I don't have to report events, I just get the events into us. I would say it's extremely frustrating for healthcare professionals to have to report one individual event to 3 different systems, maybe a local system, maybe through the national HSE system, and now here I am asking you to report to the HPRA. So we recognize we have to make that easier. We have to facilitate effective and straightforward user reporting, but it's important to acknowledge that each of those different entities has different oversights and, as I've shown you, potentially different definitions for what is a reportable incident or not. So why is it a good idea to report incidents to us? Well, as I said, it's legally obligated upon the manufacturer to report serious incidents to us. And it's even more detailed than that. They have specific timelines which they have to adhere to for different levels of risk. So the fundamental principle here is that a manufacturer, once they become aware of a serious incident, has to report it immediately. However, it's recognized that immediately doesn't always happen. So if it's a straightforward serious incident, it's within 15 days of the manufacturer's awareness of the serious incident. If it is a case of death or unanticipated serious deterioration in state of health, there's a maximum time frame of 10 days. And if it's a serious public health threat, there's a maximum time frame of 2 days. So that's really commensurate with the risk. But the fundamental principle, as you will see there, is they should be reporting it to us immediately. So the unintended benefit of increasing our levels of user reporting, where you tell us about an issue that you've experienced in our hospital, is we will immediately start the clock on the manufacturer. So if we don't hear about an event, we don't know when that clock starts until the manufacturer comes into us. Whereas if you tell us that this event has happened in my hospital today, we will start the clock on that manufacturer that afternoon. So it's a really effective way of making sure the manufacturers are adhering to their timelines, in addition to being an effective communication mechanism between yourselves and ourselves. So once we get a serious incident reported to us, we perform a risk evaluation. That looks at factors such as causality, detectability, probability of recurrence, frequency of use of the device, the probability of harm, the clinical benefit of the device, the intended and potential users, and the population affected. So a manufacturer submits a manufacturer's incident report form to us, and we evaluate that form and the information they have included relating to their investigation using those criteria. We're a small European member state on the western end of the European Union. So much like the pre-market system is a decentralized system, there is a really increased focus on coordination in the post-market phase. So all 27 competent authorities in Europe coordinate in terms of our vigilance activities, particularly if we have concern around a particular serious incident. Maybe a serious incident has happened once in Ireland, but has happened many times in Germany or France, so we can get a lot of good data from that. And also regards the appropriateness of the corrective actions. So making sure the corrective action is appropriate across Europe, but also for the health system in Ireland. As I've said, we do encourage and hopefully enable healthcare professionals, users and patients to report events. And we also undertake an analysis of our vigilance data. So when I started in the HPRA, Niall said he'd been in this regulatory system for quite a while. I've also been in it quite a while, not as long as Niall, I think, but reporting of serious incidents has increased dramatically in the last number of years. Some of that is technology-based. The overwhelming majority of the serious incidents we see in now relates to diabetes technologies, because continuous glucose monitors are great, but they have a lot of issues with them. And that has resulted in a significant amount of data that, rather than looking at every serious incident case by case, we actually try and do signal detection and trend analysis on it to identify the problems. We don't do that with any report that comes into us from a healthcare professional. Yes, it goes into our signal detection and trend analysis, but it will always have a detailed investigation. So that's very important to note. So the majority of all serious incidents lead to no corrective action at all. The manufacturer doesn't identify a problem with the device. It could be procedure related. It could be related to the circumstance the device was used. Just a component could have failed. We could satisfy ourselves the manufacturer has verified there's not a widespread problem. But in some scenarios, the manufacturer does undertake a corrective action. And where that corrective action is taken to prevent or reduce the risk of a serious incident occurring, and that action relates to devices that are on the market, that is a field safety corrective action. So there's a distinction here between a corrective action that's taken as the manufacturing site, such as improving quality control or something like that, and an action that they take for a device on the market, which could be recall of the device, it could be modification of the device, it could be advice on how the device is used, it could be informing of a look back of the device previous diagnostic results. And again, field safety corrective actions are legally required to be reported to us in the HPRA if they affect the Irish market. Field safety corrective actions are always notified by something called a field safety notice. This is a standard template that the manufacturer issues to enable healthcare facilities to identify the device, tell you why they're taking the field safety corrective action, tell you what the risk associated with the device is, and indicate what they want you to do with that information. And the reason it's a standard template is pretty straightforward. It's because everyone, I'm sure, gets a lot of marketing material from manufacturers. These actions need to be immediately identified and acted upon when they're received by the healthcare facility. So hopefully, a standard format for these enables you to identify them in a little more readily. So once you receive a field safety notice, it's important that you act upon it in a timely manner. And that might involve identifying the devices that are in your facility and returning to the manufacturer, destroying them, whatever that might be. It may, however, involve a device which you have transferred to another organization, or it may involve an issue which impacts patients who aren't any longer in the hospital. And it's important in those scenarios that if you're being asked to transmit the field safety notice to an appropriate grouping, that you do so. Now, I think that's where we come back to ensuring, and I do a lot of work with Kieran in ensuring when we have really emergent high-profile safety issues that there's a coordinated approach to this. The intention of this isn't that an issue is identified with an orthopedic implant, 20 hospitals in Ireland are affected, and immediately 20 different letters go out to the patients with that orthopedic implant. Certainly not, but it is intended that a consistent message goes to the right people who need to know about the issue. Typically, these things have an acknowledgement form to enable the manufacturer to track reconciliation. So we would ask that you complete that, send it back to the manufacturer. And the reason we ask you to do that is we will always ask the manufacturer, has every hospital in Ireland completed the acknowledgement? And we will keep our files open and keep pressuring the manufacturer until that happens. So it's important that you're able to do that. We may contact you to seek feedback on the suitability or the feasibility of the action. So I think relatively recently we had an issue with an insufflator device where the manufacturer had taken an action, and it quickly became apparent through many phone calls on a Friday evening that that action was not appropriate for the healthcare system in Ireland. So I think it's important that we have that two-way communication, and as I said, for those really high-profile ones, that we have a central mechanism via the HSE to actually manage that. And that goes for whether you're a private hospital or a HSE hospital, because the important thing is that everyone in Ireland gets the same message and gets the same oversight. Within that regard, we remain open to any sort of dialogue on an issue. If you receive a field safety notice and it's not clear, please let us know. If you receive a field safety notice and you think that this is actually going to cause significant consternation or significant change to clinical practice, please let us know. You're the experts in how these devices are used in your facility, and unless we can get that information, it's very difficult for us to challenge the manufacturer further. So what are we talking about volume-wise? Typically, there are about 500 field safety corrective actions impacting the Irish market every year. So that's quite a lot of medical devices that have an issue associated with them. So again, a field safety corrective action has the potential for recurrence of a serious deterioration in state of health, death, or a public health threat. So these are all inherently risky issues. And there are about 500 of those a year. In all of those scenarios, if you are affected by the field safety corrective action and field safety notice, the manufacturer not only is legally obligated to tell us about it, they're legally obligated to tell you about it via the field safety notice. So you should always have a field safety notice if you're impacted from a manufacturer telling you what to do. For a very small cohort of those issues, we issue other publications. So I might take these in reverse order, purely based on volume. So for about 50 of those, about 10% of the field safety corrective actions impacting Ireland, we will actually directly write to you as the hospital site. Typically that's because we're slightly concerned about the issue and we might want feedback on it, but also we're concerned that there may not be adequate awareness of the field safety corrective actions. So for about 10%, you might get an email from one of my team asking you, have you got this field safety notice? Do you have any concerns in relation to it? Have you noticed the big bold writing on paragraph 3 that says, please look back at your patients, something like that. For a much smaller cohort, about 5 to 10 per annum, we'll consider issuing a HPRA safety notice. So that is a safety notice issued by the HPRA that goes on our website. If you're a HSE hospital, it gets issued through the HSE e-alert system with associated timelines and acknowledgements around that. And that's really where we want to raise broad awareness of a specific issue. Typically, these days, much like the issues we see with continuous glucose monitors and other diabetes devices, the vast majority of HPRA safety notices we are issuing are for issues where we really think the end users are going to struggle to be contacted. So diabetes devices which people are using in their home, AEDs in the community, that kind of thing. So the message here really is it's not acceptable to wait and rely on the HPRA issuing a safety notice to tell you to act upon a safety issue. The most critical safety issues you will get are directly from the manufacturer, and there's about 500 of those a year across the system in Ireland. To assist you in identifying those, we publish a monthly summary on our website, but it's a retrospective monthly summary. So if we were notified of something on the 1st of the month, it won't go up till the end of the month. And again, you have to remember these are inherently risky issues that need to be acted on immediately. So you should have a system in place, however you organise your governance structure, for acting upon field safety notices and ensuring they're reconciled appropriately for your facility. So to conclude, the manufacturer is required to have a robust post-market surveillance system to monitor the performance of the device, and that needs to be holistic. It doesn't just cover complaints. It needs to look at the lifetime of the device and over its entire life cycle. User reporting of suspected serious incidents, and we've talked about those definitions, and you can have a look at them again and review them when you get the slides after today, is vital to the functioning of the vigilance system, not only because it enables us to take on board your feedback, but as I said, it also starts the clock on those manufacturers for their obligations. They are legally obligated to tell us about serious incidents and of field safety corrective actions. And in order to protect patients, really to emphasize, it's vital that if you receive a safety communication, most likely a field safety notice into your hospital, it's acted upon appropriately and addressed within the health institution. So thank you very much.